So lately, more and more of our favorite movies are just becoming adaptations of, comic books from the past that we read, we never read because they were out in the 50s and 40s, but they're all lately just adaptations of comic books. So today, I would like to outline the history of comic books and how they changed with America. I'm going to talk about 4 separate eras of comic books throughout the time and how they changed during those eras. I would like to start off with the birth of comic books. In 1827, the first comic book was written by a Swiss man named Rudolf Topfer, and it was called The Adventures of Obadiah Buck. If you could show it.
Did somebody turn off the projector?
Yeah.
You should never touch the projector. Ever touch the projector buttons. That's a 2-minute wait. Turn it on. Yeah, that's why there's a mute button.
Okay, well, I'll just skip that.
It's coming up. It just... All right.
This is the first comic that was ever made, and back then it wasn't called a comic book yet. The term comic book wasn't coined yet. It was just a picture book at this point. And as you can see, it was just the pictures on top and the words on the bottom. There were no word bubbles yet in comic books. And this was written in 1827, was part of a 40-page book by Rudolf Topfer. And it was one of the first comic books ever made before the 1900s, and was the first comic book in America that was published in 1849. The word comic book was coined in the early 1900s by people because they were mostly in newspapers, and they were known for their humorous material in the newspapers. In 1913, the first series of comics came out from a humorous news strip. It was like a daily news strip in the funnies. What's going on now? Just click escape. Alright, and the first series of comic books published in 1913 was called Mutt and Jeff. Moving on, I'd like to talk about another era of comic books called the Golden Age of comic books, which lasted from 1934 to 1954 and started with Action Comics' introduction, their claim to fame Superman, and ended with the Peanut Gallery, which is one of the most profitable comic books of all time. And during the Golden Age, it was said that comic book readers grew, very fast, and there was a more different kinds of comic books being made in America. And according to an article in the Yank, which was a newspaper in the 40s and 50s, 70 million Americans, which was half of our population at the time, read comic books avidly, every day. And around 1954, with the introduction of the Peanut Gallery and a lot of the old superhero comics were kind of being shunned by the adults because they depicted drug use and lots of violence that they didn't want children reading about. So they started having organized comic book bans and comic book burnings where they would go in their town and burn giant lists of comic book. And this brings us to a new era, which is called the comic book prohibition era, which is when the CCA was formed, which is the Comic Code Authority, and they're a group of publishers and editors who edit, and they have to have this stamp on the comic book for it to be sold in comic book stores or on newspaper stands. It had to be approved by the Comic Code Authority, and they had a list of rules for the people. They couldn't use any violence, they couldn't slander the government. There was just a laundry list of rules most comic book publishers had to abide by, otherwise they wouldn't be able to sell their comic books. Around the early 60s, which was 6 years after the introduction of the Comic Code Authority, most publishers were fed up with having to submit their work and get it edited and most of the time, most comics were shut down anyways because they just depicted things that parents didn't want their kids to see. So around the 1960s, people started releasing comic books without the approval of the Comic Code Authority, and show that. This was one of the first comic books released without the Comic Code Authority, and it depicts Dracula as a superhero, which people did not want to see because Dracula was like a sci-fi beast that would slay humans and kill them at night and whatnot, but it depicts him as like a hero, and it wouldn't get approved by the Comic Code Authority because they weren't allowed to depict any sci-fi material in comics at all. So people started releasing comic books like this and selling them in like not the right places. They wouldn't, instead of selling them at newsstands, they would sell them at like head shops or through advertisements in the newspaper. It was the first way that we could order subscriptions to magazines. And by the early 70s, there were so many of these underground comics out that the CCA was forced to revise their code of ethics that they had and allow more violence and whatnot. This brings us to like the new age of comics, where after the 70s, many revisions were made to the Comic Code Authority, and during the 80s, there was now a larger depiction of violence and drug use in comics. Publishers were allowed to publish what they want instead of having to abide by all these rules, and they no longer had to use the Comic Code Authority because the 80s introduced the comic book shop. It was the first time anybody had ever seen a comic book store. And so that brought more popularity to underground comics and, made a larger fan base. In the 80s also, comics like this came out, Tales from the Crypt and Elvira's Haunted Mansion, where they would depict lots of like sexuality and violence. So during the 80s, the CCA was forced to revise once again and to include sexuality and violence and different things because it depicted a changing view in America's society where we now were more open to reading about these things, whereas in the past we weren't. Moving on, you can close it out. But between the 80s and 90s, not much really happened. Comic book readers kind of slowly died, and by the 2000s, pretty much nobody reads comics anymore. We just kind of watch them when they turn into a movie. And the CCA, the Comic Code Authority, actually sold the rights to their name so they could no longer use that name and they no longer edit comic books. And I hope that this all, kind of opens you guys up to reading more comic books and, trying to find other things to read other than books, because I know they get boring.
All right, Sanya, what did you think?
I thought the institution was very well organized. It was very well structured. He talked about the different comic books, and he organized it in eras. So he talked about what each era depicted. So like the different comic books, the pictures and golden age, the different actions and stuff like that. I also like how he defined the CCA, the Comic Code Authority, and how he said it needs to be a stamp in order for it to be approved and to be distributed in society. I thought that was really good. He was very, very well engaged with the audience. He did less reading, and I thought that was pretty impressive. And overall, and his visuals was really good. He stayed consistent with his speech. He showed different types of comic books, like what sci-fi was, and what type of comics that related to his speech. And it stayed consistent with the flow of his speech. So I thought overall it was pretty good.
All right. The reference at the beginning I thought was fine. You had a good thesis statement. It's very well organized. The first half you cited the material a little bit more thoroughly than you did in the later sections. All the stuff about the code, for instance, and what happened in the 50s and 60s, I think you need to